As night descends like a heavy cloak over Rome's 7 hills, a timeless silence reigns in the heart of the city, behind its walls. The noisy footsteps of tourists have subsided, the squares are empty, and the shadow of St. Peter's Basilica stretches silently. But beneath this sacred city, in the depths, lies a place carrying the breath of centuries. This is a labyrinth woven not just of stone and mortar, but of ink, parchment, and secrets that have changed the fate of millions, the Vatican Apostolic Archives. Imagine it. Endless corridors illuminated by dim lights. The scent of ancient paper lingers in the air, slightly sweet, a little dusty, but all too wise. The echo of your footsteps on the stone floor seems to greet the spirits of the past. This is like a vault where humanity's memory of the last 1,200 years is preserved. But this vault contains not gold, but the originals of world-shaking decisions, letters to which emperors knelt, and the whispers of forgotten languages. The 85-kilometer-long shelves are not just a gigantic library, but a living organism. Each shelf is like a tributary of a river that changed the course of history. On one side, the desperate lines a king wrote to divorce his wife. On the other, the trembling handwriting of a scientist punished for deciphering the secrets of the sky. In these silent rooms, you witness time standing still. While the world outside rapidly changes, a 15th century morning and the modernity of the 21st century meet in the same dusty atmosphere within these shelves. As we embark on this adventure, we are not merely entering a library, we are walking on that fine line where reality and legend intersect. For centuries, people have called this place the Secret Archive. This name fueled curiosity. It was said that inside were evidence of alien existence, a list of descendants of Jesus, or prophecies foretelling the end of the world. But what was the truth? In which corner of those dusty shelves was the truth hidden? Now, silence all the noise in your mind. Imagine yourself standing before those enormous iron gates. They creak open, and a silence that has awaited you for centuries greets you. The air inside is cool, a protective coolness. Each parchment is a person's life. Each seal is the end of an era. Here, kings' crowns fall, saints confess their sins, and history in its most naked form awaits to be told, unhurried. This library is a mirror not only of the Vatican, but of our shared past, sometimes dark, sometimes radiant. And now it is our turn to look into that mirror. We take our first step, our fingers run along the cold stone walls, and we move towards the place where history lies in its deepest slumber. Listen. The pages rustle. The story begins.
We turn back the dusty pages of time to the early 1600s, those turbulent years when Europe was reshaped by faith, politics, and art. As the sound of horse-drawn carriages echoed through the streets of Rome, behind the high walls of the Vatican, a man holding a heavy silver key made a decision that would change the course of history. This man was Pope Paul V, known as Camillo Borghese. It was 1612. The winter sun of Rome shone like a pale golden hue on the unfinished domes of St. Peter's Basilica. Pope Paul V was not only a religious leader, but also a jurist with a passion for order. Until then, the Church's most valuable documents were scattered in papal residences, in the dungeons of various castles, or in the damp corners of monasteries. Treaties before which emperors knelt, secret correspondence, and ancient manuscripts were left to the corrosive hands of time and neglect. That very year, Pope Paul V slammed his hand on the table and issued the following order. Our history must be preserved under one roof, in a silence beyond anyone's reach. Imagine this. When Pope Paul V allocated the most secluded, most secure rooms of the palace for this purpose, he wasn't just establishing a library, he was building a fortress for humanity's collective memory. In 1612, the doors of the Archivum Secretum were symbolically closed for the first time. This closing, in fact, was an act of preservation. Enormous wooden shelves, still smelling of freshly cut pine at the time, were placed in the rooms. Classes of scribes began classifying thousands of pages of paper, leather bindings, and parchments by candlelight, night after night. The rustling of ink was the only music in those rooms during those days. Pope Paul V's move marked the professionalization of history. From that moment on, a document was no longer just a piece of paper. It had acquired the status of state secret, secretum. The only person allowed to enter these rooms was the Pope himself. He carried the key in his belt and had the locks checked daily to prevent them from rusting. Why? Because the information stored on those shelves could bring down kingdoms, change dynasties, or shake the foundations of the Church. Now imagine yourself in that first archive room. Imagine you're in those years before electricity was invented, when only oil lamps illuminated the night. The walls are so thick that wars, famines, or exuberance of the outside world never penetrate. This system established by Pope Paul V was based on the belief that knowledge was a weapon and history a treasure. Each scroll lined up on the shelves was like a silent soldier carrying the weariness of thousands of years. The establishment of the archive was in fact the birth of a secret. From 1612 onwards, this part of the Vatican acted as if it had been erased from the world map. No one knew exactly what was there, only legends spread by word of mouth. When Pope Paul V locked the doors, he preserved a frozen version of history for future generations. Today, as you pass by those doors, you still feel the solemn and weighty atmosphere of 1612. Pope Paul V may not be alive today, but the vast system he established still breathes as an 85-kilometer labyrinth. From that day to this, every document that enters this labyrinth is greeted with Paul V's authoritarian yet protective spirit. Take a deep breath. The scent of those old parchments is still there. As if nothing has changed since 1612, the secrets continue to sleep on the shelves. And we, on this silent journey, move towards the next shelf, towards the true meaning behind the famous word, secretum.
Imagine standing before a large, ornate door. On it gleams the words engraved in brass plates, Archivum Secretum Vaticanum. For centuries, this name has haunted conspiracy theorists, inspired novelists, and conjured up dark, inaccessible chambers in the minds of ordinary people. Secretum, meaning secret, but words, like people, possess a true soul hidden beneath their outward appearance. The truth is, when we delve into the word's Latin roots, we find a more subtle, more intimate meaning than we might expect. In the medieval and Renaissance world, secretum meant not a door slammed in someone's face, but rather something private, intimate, and belonging only to its owner. This wasn't the secret archive, but rather the Pope's private archive. Like a king's private garden or a writer's diary kept only for themselves, the secrets here weren't crimes hidden from the world, but the most confidential correspondence of an office. But humankind has always liked to imagine closed doors as places where storms rage within. The word secretum, as it spread from mouth to mouth, transformed into a veil of mist. People wanted to believe that behind these shelves lay not only documents, but also magical formulas that could change the course of history, forbidden lineages, and even evidence of extraterrestrial life. because sometimes the truth is quieter and more unsettling than legend. Now imagine you walk a little further down the corridor. The dim torchlight on the walls casts the shadow of the word secretum. In fact, what this word represents is that history is a property. For Pope Paul V and his successors, these documents were not the property of a church, but like a family album of an individual, a father figure. Letters of reproach from emperors to the Pope, declarations of love from queens, or excited notes scribbled by an explorer upon discovering a new continent. These were not public property, but the most intimate moments of history. In 2019, the modern world took a step to alleviate the heavy burden this word created. Pope Francis officially replaced the word secretum in the archive's name with apostolicum. Thus, what was once secret now refers to the apostle, the institutional identity of the Church. But did this change dispel the mysterious atmosphere in those corridors? Of course not, because even if you change the name of a place, you cannot change the centuries-old silence it holds. Think about your own life. Don't you have a secretum that you keep only to yourself, that you don't share with anyone? An old letter at the bottom of a drawer? A photograph that no one remembers anymore? The Vatican Archives is that shared, intimate drawer of humanity. The documents inside are so valuable not because they are secret, but because they are private. They are the naked and vulnerable moments of history. Take a deep breath. Now fill yourself with the peace of the true meaning behind that door. We are not in a darkness to be feared, but in a privacy to be respected. Secretum is merely a label. What truly matters are the stories that lie beneath it, stories that have slept for millennia. As we continue to glide through the gate of this special garden, our steps lead us to the next great mystery, to those vast 85 kilometers of shelves. Close your eyes a little tighter. Listen to the subtle rustling sound as the papers touch each other. That sound is the most intimate secret history whispers to you.
Now imagine yourself in a seemingly endless corridor with high ceilings and lined on both sides with enormous wooden shelves. This is the beginning of the famous 85-kilometer labyrinth in the heart of the Vatican. 85 kilometers. If you were to connect these shelves end to end, you could build a road made entirely of paper and ink, stretching from one city to another. This distance is not just a unit of measurement, it is a physical projection of humanity's ambitions, loves, wars, and prayers. Slow your steps. The shelves rising to your right and left are in fact layers of time. Each shelf represents a year, each compartment a decade. Here, more than 35,000 bound books and millions of individual documents sleep side by side, shoulder to shoulder. So what is hidden within this boundless silence? Imagine running your hand over the shelves without touching them. You might find in a box that famous letter written by King Henry VIII of England to the Pope in 1530. The king is requesting permission to divorce his wife. 81 seals hang from beneath the letter. Each seal carries the hope and fear of a duke, a lord. A little further on another shelf, lies the last farewell letter written by Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland, on faded paper with trembling hands just before her execution. When you touch that paper, you can feel the despair of centuries past in your fingertips. But this is not just a place for kings and queens. Within this 85-kilometer path, you will find Christopher Columbus's first reports from the New World, Michelangelo's notes full of complaints about not being paid for painting the Sistine Chapel, and Galileo Galilei's historic defense before the Inquisition. Here, every parchment is a window into a moment when a person breathed, cried, and laughed. Take a deep breath. The coolness of the surroundings envelops you.
As you proceed towards the lower levels of the archive, the air grows slightly heavier. Here, there are special compartments built underground called bunkers that can withstand even atomic bombs. The light is dimmer here, the silence more intense. In these special rooms, the oldest papyri dating back to the 8th century, gold-sealed decrees, and handwritten Bibles are preserved. Some documents are so fragile that even looking at them could invite the destructive effects of time. Therefore, they sleep in the comforting embrace of darkness. This 85-kilometer distance is in fact a mirror. It is a record of what humanity has achieved, what it has destroyed, and what it wishes to forget. Each shelf whispers a secret. On one side, the excitement of scientific discoveries. On the other, the pain of religious conflicts. Inside, there are not only truths, but also falsehoods accepted as truth for centuries, excommunications that have been overturned, and letters that were never sent. Now imagine standing in the middle of this vast labyrinth and looking up to the very top of the shelves. There, amidst dusty volumes, lie not just papers, but decisions that determine the fate of billions of people. Walking these corridors is to feel the pulse of history. This silent cry, stretching for 85 kilometers, reminds us nothing is ever completely lost. It only awaits the right hand to touch it and awaken it from its deep slumber.
Gaining access to the Vatican Apostolic Archives is one of the most rigorous academic processes in the world. Contrary to popular belief, this is not a museum where you can simply buy a ticket or a public library where anyone can browse books. It is a fortress of knowledge where every step is recorded, every intention is scrutinized, and only a selected minority can enter. Access rules are based on a chain of protocols meticulously maintained for centuries. The first requirement for a researcher to step through these doors is to be an academic with a master's or doctoral degree. But even that is not enough. The applicant must submit a formal letter of intent detailing their research and proving why this work can only be done in the Vatican archives and not in any other library. A letter of recommendation from an academic institution or a renowned historian is also mandatory. It is almost impossible for undergraduate students or amateur historians simply curious to pass this threshold. Once access is granted, the rules become even stricter. Every morning, a rigorous security check is conducted at the entrance to the archives. Bringing bags, pens, notebooks, cameras, or phones inside is strictly forbidden. Researchers are only allowed to use a pencil and a few blank pages of paper. The slightest possibility of ink damaging the centuries-old parchment is the primary reason for this prohibition. The working system inside is a prime example of strict discipline. A researcher is only allowed to request 3 documents or manuscripts per day. Archival staff retrieve these documents from among the enormous shelves, and they are allowed to be examined at special tables under dim light. Some documents are so delicate that researchers are forbidden to touch them. Staff members turn the pages wearing white gloves. Furthermore, photocopying or digitizing any document is not permitted. Additional permission from the Pope's special representatives is required for this. But is access to every document possible? No. The Vatican has a 75-year rule. As a general principle, documents from the last 75 years are closed to researchers. This period is set to account for the possibility that the individuals mentioned may no longer be alive, and to allow diplomatic sensitivities to cool. For example, documents from the reign of Pope John Paul II, researchers have had to wait decades for access to documents from the World War II era. Furthermore, some documents are classified as private property and can be permanently closed to access by the Pope's personal decree. Issues such as the Cardinal's private confession records and details of the voting for unelected papal candidates are subject to absolute secrecy.
These rules stem from the fact that the Vatican is not only a state, but also a spiritual center. Information here is not merely data, but a sacred trust that must be preserved. Consequently, working in the Vatican archives is a privilege. Only 1,200 to 1,500 researchers are granted this permission annually. These individuals trace the past in the deepest and quietest chambers of history, accompanied only by the rustling of papers. For them, this process is less like a library visit and more like a kind of academic rite performed in the dusty corridors of history.
The Vatican Apostolic Archives is not a repository of randomly arranged books, but a massive administrative machine that operates like clockwork. Understanding how this structure is organized helps us understand why it is the world's most secure information center. The archives consist of several main sections that are not physically connected, but are managed with a perfectly hierarchical order. The most striking physical structure is the underground annex, known as Il Bunker, built in the early 1980s by Pope John Paul II. It is buried deep within the Cortile del Belvedere, Belvedere Courtyard, beneath the Vatican Museum. This two-story reinforced concrete, fully protected structure is designed to protect thousands of tons of parchment and paper from humidity, temperature fluctuations, and potential attacks. The air temperature and humidity inside are kept constant at the same level every day of the year to prevent the documents from deteriorating. The organizational chart of the archives shows a historical stratification. Documents are divided into main categories called funds. These funds are classified according to the type of document or its source. For example, the Secretariat of State Fund contains the Vatican's diplomatic correspondence with other countries. The Rota Romana Fund contains court records relating to canon law, and the Nunciatures Fund houses intelligence reports sent to the center by papal representatives, nuncius, around the world. This system is so sophisticated that finding a 17th-century diplomatic note takes only a few minutes thanks to its advanced cataloging system. The organization is headed by a cardinal holding the title of Archivist of the Holy Roman Church. Below him is a professional prefect who manages operational processes. The archive's core workforce consists of paleographers, experts in ancient writing, restorers, and catalog specialists. This team not only preserves documents, but also repairs worn pages with microsurgical precision. Cleaning a 400-year-old ink stain from a document or piecing together a broken seal are part of this organization's daily routine. The most interesting organizational detail in the system is the Indici room. This is the researcher's first stop. Here, thousands of volumes of handwritten indexes summarizing every millimeter of the 85 kilometers of shelves are kept. When digital catalogs are insufficient, a researcher must open an 18th-century index book to find the shelf number of the document they're looking for. These indexes are works of art and historical sources in themselves. Furthermore, the archive is not limited to paper documents. The Diplomatic Archives section contains thousands of metal seals, wax seals, silver boxes, and silk laces. Each object is cataloged and preserved along with the document to which it is attached. This structure is the result of an ancient understanding that information should be preserved not only as text, but also as a physical object. The complex and disciplined structure of the Vatican Apostolic Archives elevates it from a mere library to the world's largest institutional memory. With no documents lost and every unit working seamlessly together, the system continues to grow with each new page added since 1612.
As we journey through the vast corridors of the Vatican archives, we arrive at the point where paper gives way to parchment, and the crude handwriting preceding Latin is replaced by more primitive but magnificent characters. The oldest layers of the archives are not merely documents, but physical cornerstones of Western civilization and the history of Christianity.
Each piece here is a miracle, having survived fires, looting, and centuries of dampness. The oldest piece in the archives and of the greatest historical significance is the Liber Diurnus Romanorum Pontificum, dating back to the 8th century. This work is the formula book of the papal chancellorship, that is, how a pope was to be elected, how he was to take the oath, and how he was to correspond with other kings were determined according to the templates in this book. This document is the most concrete evidence of how the Vatican was born as a state mechanism. Although the ink is faded in places, you can still see the pen strokes of a scribe from 1200 years ago. However, the archive's true treasures are the collection known as the Literae Aureae, or golden letters. These documents are decrees adorned with pure gold seals, or bulla, in which the most powerful emperors and kings of Europe declared their allegiance to the papacy. One of the most striking pieces in this collection is the gold-sealed document from 1213, in which King John of England declared his kingdom to the Pope as a feudal estate. These heavy seals demonstrate that in those times, a promise was not merely a promise, but was etched into history with gold and leather. Further through the time tunnel, we encounter a massive parchment scroll from the 13th century, the trial records of the Knights Templar. This scroll, several meters long, contains the confessions of the knights interrogated by Pope Clement V at Chinon Castle in 1308. The stains and erased words on this scroll are silent witnesses to the political oppression and torture of that era. The fall of the knights, one of history's greatest mysteries, lies starkly before our eyes in these dusty original texts. In the later, yet still ancient sections of the archive are maps of the Age of Discovery. Late 15th century Portolan maps, adorned with sea monsters and dating back to before the precise borders of the Americas were drawn, are a testament to humanity's curiosity and fear of the unknown. In particular, Pope Alexander VI's famous Inter Caetera Edict of 1493, which divided the world between Spain and Portugal, is the paper that marked the beginning of modern colonial history. This oldest section of documents is, in essence, a story of survival. Despite catastrophes such as soldiers stealing parchments to make bedding for their horses during the sack of Rome in 1527, or Napoleon having the entire archive moved to Paris, the fact that these documents have somehow survived to this day is an achievement. Every page in these rooms today is not only a source of information, but also a symbol of physical resilience. What we see here, along the timeline stretching from the 8th century to the present, is this: powers change, languages evolve, empires fall, yet those inked lines retain the weight they had on the day they were written. Now, leaving this ancient silence behind, we will journey to a more recent history, to a highly controversial period that opened its doors to the world in 2020, the archives of Pope Pius XII.
The morning of March 2nd, 2020 marked a historic turning point for the Vatican archives. Years of waiting had ended, and on the instructions of Pope Francis, secret documents belonging to Pope Pius XII during World War II were opened to researchers. This was not merely dusting off a library shelf, but unlocking one of modern history's greatest moral and political conundrums. This massive data set, approximately 16 million pages long, awaited the unveiling of the Vatican's stance on the Holocaust and Nazi Germany. Pius XII is known among historians as Hitler's pope, but defended by the Vatican as a hero who secretly saved tens of thousands of Jews. The archives opened in 2020 aimed to bridge the gap between these two opposing viewpoints. Among the documents were coded reports from papal legates in Berlin, letters containing cries for help from concentration camps, and internal correspondence detailing how the Vatican maintained its policy of neutrality.
The initial findings revealed by the opening of the archives confirmed that the Vatican was aware of the Holocaust very early on. Reports from 1942 detailed massacres in Ukraine and Poland, bringing them to the Pope's desk. However, the documents also offered clues as to why the Pope remained silent. Pope Pius XII feared that a strong statement against the Nazis would endanger the lives of Catholics under occupation and weaken the only force preventing the spread of communism in Europe, Germany. The most poignant pieces in these archives are the handwritten letters written to the Pope by thousands of ordinary people. The heart-wrenching lines, pleading, "Holy Father, they are taking our families, please do something," still linger like embers within the cold, bureaucratic structure of the archives. Researchers discovered that some of these letters were marked with notes such as "assisted" or "visa provided." This strengthened claims that the Vatican, instead of issuing an open condemnation, secretly issued thousands of passports and secure transit documents. Another significant aspect of the 2020 opening was digitization. The Vatican scanned a large portion of the documents from this sensitive period, making them available to researchers on computer screens. This was a huge step towards transparency, breaking the image of the secret archives. However, some historians continue to ask, are there still missing pieces? In particular, documents concerning the rat lines, which allegedly helped Nazi war criminals escape to South America after 1945, remain among the most examined and debated folders. The archives of Pope Pius XII are evidence that history is not black and white and that the gray areas can be quite profound. Opened in 2020, these doors not only laid bare the legacy of a pope, but also the Church's reckoning with its conscience during one of the world's darkest periods. These documents have launched a decades-long marathon of study for historians. Now we leave this recent and weighty agenda behind. For future researchers, we will look at how this vast wealth of information has been preserved and transferred to the digital world. Our next stop is the technological transformation where ancient parchments are being turned into pixels.
The Vatican Apostolic Archives is not only a custodian of the past, but also a digital fortress of the future. In this labyrinth where ink has clung to paper for centuries, a silent but monumental revolution has been underway for the past 2 decades. The project to digitize every centimeter of the 85-kilometer shelf, every manuscript, and every seal is one of the greatest archival transformation operations in human history. The fundamental aim of the digitization project is to lighten the burden on physical documents. Every opening and closing of a parchment causes the ink to spill, the paper fibers to break, and the texture to deteriorate. Thanks to digital preservation, researchers can now work on a high-resolution copy of the original document instead of touching it. This is a security shield that extends the life of the original text for centuries. The technology used by the Vatican goes far beyond a simple scanner. The cameras used in the archive laboratories have a sensitivity capable of capturing details as small as 1/10 of a millimeter. For light-sensitive documents in particular, cold light systems and vacuum tables that flatten the folds of the parchment are used. However, the real technological marvel is the software called Incipit, an advanced stage of optical character recognition, OCR. This software can digitally decipher even Latin texts from the 15th century, handwritten and full of abbreviations which are almost impossible to read today. So, where is all this data stored? Each archived page is saved in a format called FITS, Flexible Image Transport System, originally developed by NASA for storing space images. This format was chosen because it remains up to date even after 50 years and can be read by any software. The Vatican wants the digital data to be timeless, just like the parchment.
They need to be sure that a document scanned today can be opened even with technology 200 years from now. This project is also a step towards democratization. Although not every document is accessible online, millions of digitized pages are gradually being made available online to researchers. A historian no longer needs to fly to Rome to examine a 14th century court record. The digital library system gives select academics the chance to study these secrets from the other side of the world. However, the digitization process is not just about scanning. The philosophy of preservation for the future also includes backing up data against a potential global catastrophe. Digital copies of the archive are stored on special servers unaffected by electromagnetic waves and in secure storage centers in different parts of the world. Even if the physical archive is destroyed by fire or a natural disaster, this vast memory of humanity will continue to exist in the digital universe. The fact that a researcher today can magnify and examine the fibers of an 800-year-old manuscript on a computer screen is proof of how the Vatican blends ancient tradition with modern science. As we continue to walk through these corridors, we are actually passing through not only papers, but also through pixels moving at the speed of light. Next, we will look at the people who are the soul of this vast system, the modern guardians of these secrets.
When one thinks of the Vatican Apostolic Archives, one usually conjures up images of vast shelves and dusty parchments. However, the real force keeping this colossal machine running is the people who work silently. They are the modern-day guardians, the custos, holding the most intimate secrets of history in their hands. These officials are not just librarians, they're also paleographers, linguists, chemists, and, most importantly, confidants endowed with absolute loyalty. To become an archivist, academic achievement alone is not enough. These individuals undergo the Vatican's most rigorous security checks. Upon starting their duties, they swear a sacred oath to protect the confidentiality of the information in their possession. The weight of this oath requires them not to leak any document they see or any letter they read to the outside world. They are shadow figures who live within history but choose to remain outside of it. Imagine a restoration specialist bent over a 600-year-old document, working almost breathlessly. This person's job isn't simply to glue a torn piece of paper together. They must know the adhesive formula from the period the paper was made, the acidity of the ink, and the animal from which the parchment was obtained. A wrong intervention could destroy a piece of history forever. In these laboratories, the latest capabilities of modern technology intertwine with the traditional methods of the Middle Ages. Restoring a page sometimes takes weeks, sometimes months. It's a discipline that requires great patience and dedication. The greatest skill of archivists is reading the unreadable. Ancient handwriting is very different from the alphabets we use today. It's full of abbreviations, period dialects, and sometimes deliberately used encryptions. When a paleographer reads a hastily scribbled note from the 14th century, they must be familiar with the mentality of that era and the hand gestures of the writer. For them, a letter is not just a symbol, but a key to time travel. However, the most challenging responsibility of these officers is their relationship with researchers. Archivist experts meticulously oversee which document is given to whom and which pages can be photographed. They are the last line of defense between curious minds seeking information and the security of that information. When a researcher gets too close or questions a restricted area, a guard's polite but firm demeanor prevents them from crossing that boundary. These guards know every corner of the 85 kilometers of shelves by heart. Their memory holds the information on where each index is located and which document lies in which box.
For them, this archive is not a cold building, but a living organism they must protect. When the workday ends, the last guard to lock the massive iron doors and turn off the lights is in fact the one who ensures that humanity's collective memory sleeps safely.
Deep within the Vatican archives lies a folder labeled Miscellanea Armatio XV. This seemingly simple file contains original evidence of one of the most dramatic and debated moments in modern science, the transcripts of Galileo Galilei's 1633 Inquisition trial. These documents represent not merely the trial of a scientist, but a written record of that colossal rift between belief and observation, authority and truth. To get straight to the point, the transcripts in this folder are a verbatim account of Galileo's statements at the monastery of Minerva in Rome. For years, this trial was thought to be simply a dispute over whether the Earth revolves or not. However, the original documents in the archives reveal a far more complex and political issue. The transcripts clearly show how Galileo was isolated despite his previous friendship with Pope Urban VIII, and how challenging and treacherous the questions posed by the Inquisition judges were. The most striking detail in the documents is Galileo's handwritten defenses. The state of mind of this elderly man, whose eyesight had weakened at the moment he was forced to deny the truths he saw through his telescope, can be read even in the ink stains on the paper. The records contain those harsh warnings from the judges who found him seriously suspicious and told him he should abandon his defense of the Copernican system. Contrary to popular belief, there is no physical record of Galileo being tortured, but the documents clearly confirm that he was shown torture chambers and subjected to psychological pressure. The real mystery in this part of the archive is the famous denial text that Galileo read while kneeling at the end of the trial. Those lines in which he says, "I, Galileo Galilei, renounce and condemn my false idea that the sun is at the center and the earth moves," are still in that folder today. However, marginal notes suggest that the Church itself wasn't entirely certain about this decision, knowing deep down that the geocentric model was being shaken. These records were hidden from the world for centuries. When Napoleon Bonaparte had the Vatican archives moved to Paris in 1810, he most wanted to acquire this file. In fact, the file was lost for a time and only returned to Rome years later. The reason the Church guarded these records so tightly was that the case was not so much a scientific error as the first major blow to the Church's infallible authority. The true records of the Galileo trial teach us this. Sometimes the documents in the archives not only tell the story of the past, but also conceal the fears of an institution and a person's struggle to defend the truth. It was these honest but painful records from 1633, hidden on dusty shelves, that paved the way for Pope John Paul II's formal apology to Galileo in 1992. Now we move from this scientific tragedy to another, far darker case that ended in fire. In the next episode, we will trace the last words of a man braver and perhaps more unfortunate than Galileo, Giordano Bruno.
In one of the darkest corners of the Vatican archives, among the decisions meticulously kept by the Inquisition, one name shines brighter than the others: Giordano Bruno. Galileo escaped house arrest, but the records in the archives document a far more tragic end for Bruno. This file is not just a trial of one man, but a report on the mentality of that era, where the idea of the infinity of the universe was seen as a threat. Let's focus directly on the truth. Unfortunately, a large portion of the original transcripts of Giordano Bruno's 8-year trial are lost. Only the summary remains of these documents, which were transported to Paris during the Napoleonic era and are thought to have been destroyed during their return.
However, even this summary is enough to understand how radical a mind Bruno possessed and why the Vatican feared him so much. In the transcripts, Bruno claimed not only that the Earth rotates, but that the universe is infinite, and that every star is actually a sun around which other worlds revolve. For the end of the 16th century, this was the greatest blow to the belief in God's uniqueness in the universe. According to the archival summaries, Bruno's demeanor before the judges is very different from that of the other defendants. While most defendants knelt and begged for forgiveness, Bruno's statements are marked by unwavering pride. The most shocking moment recorded is when he heard the death sentence pronounced against him on February 8, 1600. According to archival records, Bruno turned to the cardinals who read the death sentence and uttered his famous words, "Perhaps you, while reading this sentence to me, are more afraid than I am listening to it." This sentence, noted in rough handwriting, is the most concrete evidence of the tension in that room. The documents list point by point why Bruno was considered an incorrigible heretic. Not only his scientific views, but also his religious ideas, such as the belief that Jesus was a sorcerer and the reality of transmigration of souls, are included in this file. For the Vatican, Bruno was not merely an astronomer, but a rebel who sought to fundamentally shake the entire belief system. The final notes in the archives date back to the morning of February 17, 1600, to Campo dei Fiori in Rome. The records confirm that his tongue was bound with a wooden apparatus to prevent him from speaking before being burned. The Church was so afraid that his last words would poison the people that it chose to condemn him to silence and turn him to ashes. The reason this file is kept in the archives is not a monument to victory, but a cautionary tale. However, centuries later, these documents have transformed Bruno from a victim into the first great martyr of free thought. Today, every historian who looks at this summary in the Vatican archives feels the unquenchable fire behind the ink. Bruno's theory of an infinite universe is the foundation of modern science, and while the names of those who condemned him are forgotten, Bruno's name occupies the most honorable place on those dusty shelves. Now, leaving behind the traces of that fiery execution, we turn to another mysterious and equally powerful group in the archives, the most enigmatic knights in history. In the next episode, we will return to 1307 and examine the famous scroll documents that explain why the Templar Knights were annihilated overnight.
One of the most valuable treasures in the Vatican archives, and physically one of the most impressive, is the Chinon scroll. This yellowed scroll, several meters long, is the legal record of the process that began on that infamous Friday morning in 1307 and destroyed the most powerful military order in the Christian world overnight. Believed to be lost for centuries, but accidentally discovered in the wrong box in 2001, this document reveals the true end of the Knights Templar in all its starkness. Let's get straight to the point. The 1307 trials were one of the greatest political conspiracies history has ever seen. King Philip the Fair of France accused the knights of heresy in order to get rid of their enormous debts and seize their wealth. The archival records contain the testimonies given by the knights under severe torture. The accusations of worshipping a mysterious idol called Baphomet, spitting on the cross, and immorality in secret rituals mentioned in the records were actually written not by the knights themselves, but by those who accused them. However, the real bombshell in the archives is the content of the Chinon parchment discovered in 2001. This document proves that the Pope Clement V actually believed in the innocence of the knights. According to the records, in 1308, the Pope sent special representatives to Chinon Castle and secretly interrogated the leaders, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay. As a result of this interrogation, although the Pope acknowledged that the knights had made some mistakes in their ceremonies, he decided that they were not heretics and officially exonerated them. So why were they burned at the stake? Diplomatic correspondence in the archives reveals the Pope's helplessness at the time. As a result of military threats and pressure from King Philip of France, the Pope was forced to conceal his own decision to exonerate them. The documents in the archives are full of secret notes showing that the Pope dissolved the order not because it was illegal, but in order to preserve the unity and peace of the Church. So the Knights Templar were destroyed not because they blasphemed against God, but because they were sacrificed in a political bargain between the Vatican and a king. Another interesting detail in the documents concerns the Knights' treasury. Archival records state that the order's properties were actually transferred to the Knights Hospitaller. However, there are no official notes about the ships lost during this transfer, the castles emptied, and the secret records that were never found. These gaps are as striking as the archive itself. It's as if someone deliberately wanted that part of history to remain unwritten. When Grand Master Jacques de Molay, just before his burning in 1314, called upon the Pope and the King to account before God, those words continued to echo in the dark corridors of the archive. Today, researchers who look at that scroll of parchment see how politics, not justice, was sacrificed in ink. The end of the Knights Templar is the most tragic evidence of the power of the Vatican, and at the same time, how that power can be manipulated.
One of the most magnificent, yet diplomatically devastating documents in the Vatican archives is a massive parchment from England dating back to 1530. It is King Henry VIII's final and most forceful request to Pope Clement VII to divorce his wife Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn. Below the letter hang 81 red wax seals, each signed by one of England's most powerful dukes, counts, and clergy. This is a collective threat, not just from a king, but from a nation. Let's look directly at the matter. Henry considered Catherine's inability to bear him a male heir a divine curse and demanded that the marriage be declared null and void. However, secret correspondence in the archives makes it much clearer why the Pope refused this request. The issue was not theological, but entirely military. Catherine was the aunt of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man of the time, whose armies were besieging Rome and effectively holding the Pope captive. If the Pope agreed to Henry's marriage, he would be eliminated by the emperor. If he refused, he would lose England. Archival notes document how the Pope was torn between these two conflicting forces and how he concocted excuses in his letters to Henry to buy time. The most intriguing pieces in the archives are Henry's love letters to Anne Boleyn. The fact that these letters somehow fell into the Vatican's hands, likely through spies, demonstrates the depth of the intelligence network of that era. These intimate lines, written by the king to the woman he addressed as the owner of my heart, are among the most humane yet strategically important documents in the archives today. The Vatican preserved these letters to prove that the king's intention was not a religious necessity, but a carnal desire. The result was the rejection of that enormous letter bearing 81 seals. Records in the archives from 1534 state that England completely severed its ties with Rome, and the king declared himself head of the Church of England. This was a disaster for the Vatican. An entire island nation had been cut off from the Catholic world because of a divorce case. From that day forward, the English file in the archives was kept not as the records of an ally, but as the file of a rebel. When Henry VIII's sealed letter is displayed in the archives today, it is not seen merely as a request for divorce. It is the most concrete evidence of how diplomacy failed, how personal ambitions overridden doctrines, and how the course of history was changed with a single stamp of seal.
Henry obtained the divorce he desired, but the Vatican also preserved that enormous sealed letter, which still sits on those shelves today and was never returned, as a cautionary tale.
In the Vatican archives, among the files dating back to 1521, there is a document that irreversibly changed the course of history, Decet Romanum Pontificem. This is the text of the original bull, papal bull, in which Pope Leo X formally excommunicated the German priest Martin Luther, that is, excluded him from the church and society. However, the records in the archive whisper that this document is not just a penalty ticket, but a document of the disintegration of an empire and the birth pangs of the modern world. Let's get straight to the heart of the matter. When Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church in 1517, the Vatican initially saw it as the delirium of a drunken German priest. The correspondence from that period in the archive is full of notes showing how much Rome underestimated this danger. In the letters the cardinals wrote to each other, Luther's lack of obedience was discussed as a disciplinary problem rather than his ideas. However, when Luther's ideas spread rapidly throughout Europe thanks to the printing press, you can see how the tone in the archives suddenly hardened and how fear and anger were reflected in the ink. One of the most critical pieces in the archive are Luther's letter corruption. In response, the Vatican issued the Ex Surge Domine edict dated 1520, ordering the burning of Luther's books. Records in the archive document the shock experienced by the Pope when he heard that Luther had thrown this edict into the fire in front of the public, and how hastily the subsequent definitive excommunication decision was prepared. There are not only religious texts in this file. It also includes intelligence reports about how the German princes protected Luther. The Vatican spies had reported to Rome with great concern that Luther had translated the Bible into German while hiding in the Wartburg Castle, and that this would destroy the Catholic authority over the people. These reports are evidence that the reform is not just a religious debate, but also how the balance of power in Europe has changed hands. While the excommunication letter stands in the cool corridors of the archive today, it's actually a symbol of failure. The Church thought that by excommunicating Luther it would silence him. However, the records in the archive from the following centuries painfully describe the transformation of Protestantism into a huge power and the dragging of Europe into bloody sectarian wars. The Decet Romanum Pontificem document is the first breaking point when the absolute spiritual authority that the Vatican once had cracked. Although the Martin Luther case may seem like a closed file in the archive, its effects are still felt among the shelves. This rebellion forced the Church to make a counter-reformation within itself and laid the foundations of modern Europe. We now move from this religious storm to perhaps the darkest and most morally questioned figure in the archive, the poisonous Pope of the Renaissance.
When you open the folders named Borgia in the Vatican archives, you will see not only the records of religious ceremonies, documents of murders, allegations of poisoning, and an incredible greed for wealth emerge. Rodrigo Borgia, aka Pope VI Alexander, is the most controversial figure in Vatican history. His reign was the year when the papal office turned into Italy's most powerful and dangerous dynastic battleground, rather than a spiritual center. Let's focus directly on the truth. Archived conclave, Pope election records from 1492, VI gives very clear clues about how Alexander came to this position. Reports that he eliminated his rivals with bribes and promised huge estates and gold to the cardinals were noted meticulously by his opponents at the time. These bribery lists in the archive are the most concrete evidence of how the papacy has transformed from an office of faith into a seat for sale.
However, what really makes Borgia scandalous is the family correspondence in the archive. VI Alexander's relationships with his children, Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, are an example of nepotism that disregards church law. The archive contains decrees stating that the Pope made his son Cesare a cardinal when he was still a child, and diplomatic documents indicating that he married and divorced his daughter many times for the sake of political alliances. Especially the astronomical amounts spent for Lucrezia's wedding and the invoices for the magnificent banquets held in the Vatican palaces are still among the extravagance records of the archive. The darker part of the archive is about the famous poison called cantarella. Poisoned wines and sudden deaths, which the Borgia family allegedly used to eliminate their rivals, are frequently mentioned in envoy reports of that period. Although some of these deaths are rumors, the autopsy-like notes in the archive and the cardinal's sudden changes in wills confirm the climate of fear created by the Borgia family. It is clearly seen in these secret correspondence that the justice mechanism, directed by the Pope himself, is actually a sword used to clear the obstacles in front of the Borgia dynasty. However, there's another side to this dark picture. Art records in the archive also show how VI Alexander supported geniuses such as Michelangelo and Pinturicchio and turned the Vatican into an art center. In other words, he was both seen as an antichrist and became one of the greatest patrons of the Renaissance. When he died in 1503, it is said that his body decomposed so quickly that it was interpreted by the public as his pact with the devil had expired. The burial records in the archive are silent witnesses to this terrible sight and the disorder in the funeral ceremony. VI Alexander Borgia's file represents the deepest moral pit the Vatican has fallen into as an institution. But at the same time, the lessons learned from this period laid the foundation for how the Church would restructure itself in later centuries. We now move from this personal corruption to a more systematic and social horror.
In the Vatican archives, there are some volumes whose very cover sends shivers down one's spine. The most famous of these is Malleus Maleficarum, written by Heinrich Kramer in 1486, whose name literally means the hammer of witches. This book is not just a collection of superstitions, it is an official guide to murder that inquisitors, local rulers, and clergymen used for centuries to send innocent women, healers, and individuals deemed different by society to their deaths. Let's get straight to the point. Why was this book so dangerous? Records in the archives show that Malleus Maleficarum was actually legitimized by a 1484 edict, Summus Desiderantes Affectibus, of Pope Innocent VIII. In the correspondence from that period in the archives, you can see how the Church institutionalized supernatural fears in Europe. The book describes the irrational methods used to determine whether a woman was a witch. Throwing victims into water, piercing their bodies with needles to find marks of the devil, and endless torture sessions were listed as if they were rules of law. The local Inquisition court records in the archives brutally document how this guideline was implemented. The files contain the desperate testimonies of accused women, unfounded denunciations from neighbors, and the creatively brutal methods judges employed to extract confessions. The Malleus Maleficarum granted the judge unlimited power. The accused could not have a lawyer because those who defended witches were also considered witches. This chain of logic in the archives is a chronicle of how a society was driven to mass hysteria by fear and ignorance. However, there are other lesser-known but equally important documents in the archives, those who opposed the witch hunt. Yes, there were those within the Church who opposed this savagery. By the 17th century, letters from figures like the Jesuit priest Friedrich Spee, arguing that confessions obtained through torture were invalid, began to surface in the archives. Spee wrote in his secret notes in the archives, "If we were judged by these methods, we would all be declared witches." Such documents show the beginning of a process of self-reflection within the Church and the gradual abandonment of witch hunts. The witch hunt files in the Vatican archives tell us how religion could be transformed into an instrument of oppression and how the concept of evil was constructed on paper. These thousands of pages of court records are like the only tombstones of those nameless people who perished at the stake. Sometimes the ink doesn't just carry information. Sometimes it carries the silent cry of pain and injustice imprinted on those papers. Now we move from this societal madness to another list where thought and knowledge were imprisoned. In the next section, we will examine the official list of books banned, burned, and destroyed throughout the centuries, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum.
The Vatican archives contain thick, heavy volumes meticulously updated from 1559 to 1966. These volumes constitute the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, or List of Prohibited Books. This list was not merely a recommendation not to read, it was the legal basis for severe penalties, including excommunication, for Catholics who possessed, read, or sold these books. The records in the archives document how the Vatican established a vast censorship army to stop the spread of dangerous ideas that emerged after the invention of the printing press. Let's get straight to the point. How did a book end up on this list? The archives contain thousands of pages of review reports kept by a unit known as the Holy Office. When a report about a book came in, a designated reader would examine it line by line, noting any passages deemed contrary to the tenets of faith. Ironically, these censorship reports in the archives include the names of geniuses who changed world history. The works of authors such as Galileo, Kepler, Descartes, Kant, Spinoza, and even Victor Hugo were included in this list on the grounds that they poisoned minds. The most interesting details in the archive are the letters authors wrote to the Pope pleading to have their books removed from the list. Some authors tried to prove they were misunderstood, while others tried to ensure the survival of the work by agreeing to censor only certain parts of the book, expurgatio. The cleaned-up copies of the books in the archive are full of sentences scribbled in ink and pages cut out. This is physical evidence of how knowledge was pruned. However, the list was not limited to science and philosophy. Archival records show that erotic literature, books on magic, and of course the works of Protestant authors were met with an absolute ban. The execution reports kept of the burning of the books included in the list in public squares are among the saddest documents in the archive today. The Vatican believed that by burning the paper, it could also destroy the idea. However, secret reports in the archives confess with great despair how these banned books became even more popular on the black market. The story of the Index is, in essence, a triumph of human curiosity over censorship. 20th century records in the archives document how impossible it became to maintain this list with the advent of radio and television. Finally, in 1966, when Pope Paul VI officially abolished the list, the Forbidden Books unit in the archives also became history. What we see when we look at those lists today is that ideas once considered dangerous are now cornerstones of the modern world. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum is a dusty monument to the fact that knowledge cannot be imprisoned and how even history's greatest censorship mechanism succumbed to the passage of time.
The Vatican archives, containing thousands of folders covering the years 1939 to 1945, holds one of history's greatest moral dilemmas. Documents from this period reveal how the Vatican, while simultaneously attempting to maintain a diplomatic balance with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, donned a shield of neutrality amidst the conflagration engulfing the world. The reports in the archives show how this so-called silence was actually woven together by a noisy behind-the-scenes diplomacy. Let's focus directly on the facts. The diplomatic correspondence in the archives clearly states that the Vatican viewed Nazi ideology as anti-Christian paganism. However, the Reichskonkordat, Treaty of the German Church, signed in 1933, remains in the archives as a document that tied the Vatican's hands. Records show that Pope Pius XII's reluctance to directly condemn Hitler stemmed from the fear that millions of Catholics in Germany would fall victim to Nazi retaliation. Secret notes in the archives reveal the Pope's defense. "If my words cannot save even one person, I should not endanger thousands," proving that this silence was a strategic choice. However, the sections of the archives that seek to answer the question of collaboration are more complex. The Vatican's view of communism as a greater threat than Nazism is evident in many analyses within the archives. Reports suggesting that the Nazis would pose a kind of obstacle to the atheist threat from Russia document the lapse of judgment or pragmatism experienced by the Vatican bureaucracy at the time. One of the most striking pieces in the archives is the Vatican's intelligence network. Possessing one of the world's best intelligence agencies, the Church was informed about the course of the war and Nazi atrocities before anyone else, thanks to reports from priests and bishops across Europe. Detailed reports concerning the establishment of concentration camps, the bombing of cities, and the extermination of the Jewish population are among the most poignant pages of the archives today. Did the Vatican share this information with its allies, or did it keep it in its own vaults? Coded telegrams in the archives show that this sharing was limited and extremely selective. This silence led to a significant loss of trust in the Vatican after the war. The records in the archives describe the Vatican's great efforts after 1945 to shift from survival mode back to moral leadership. However, the weight of those silent years in the documents still hangs on the shelves. The Vatican's role during this period was neither pure heroism nor pure collaboration. It is a colossal diplomatic drama hidden in the gray corridors of the archives. Now, from this general picture, we will focus on the most painful issue of that period, the one that most cornered the Vatican, the Holocaust.
Deep within the War Years folders of the Vatican archives lie thousands of yellowed letters, stained in places with tears. These letters were written by Jewish families across Europe in the dark ages of the 1940s, addressed directly to Pope Pius XII. With the full accessibility of these documents in 2020, the Vatican's role during the Holocaust transformed from a myth of absolute silence into a complex bureaucracy and a reality of covert aid operations. Let's look at the direct evidence. Records in the archives prove that the Vatican was aware of what was happening in the extermination camps in Poland by the autumn of 1942. Secret telegrams between Rzym, Rome, and Warsaw clearly state that people were being taken by train to unknown locations and never returned. However, Pope Pius XII, the reason why Pius avoided mentioning the word Jew in public discourse regarding this tragedy, instead using the general expression victims of the genocide, is hidden in the strategic notes in the archives. Notes from the Pope's advisors reflect the concern that directly targeting the Nazis would disrupt the ongoing secret rescue operations. One of the most shocking documents in the archives concerns the fake baptism certificates and visas provided by the Vatican to thousands of Jews. The records contain logistical details of how the doors of monasteries in Rome and buildings within the Vatican itself were opened to Jewish refugees during the massive raid in 1943. These documents prove that more than 4,000 people survived under the Church's protection in Rome alone. Records of the Emergency Aid Fund in the archives show that these operations were financed directly from the papal budget. However, the documents do not only tell stories of heroism. The archives also contain internal correspondence showing that some high-ranking church officials maintained anti-Semitic views or slowed down aid because they believed in Nazi victory. Pius XII's silence is still debated today, with the question posed in the archives: could a louder voice have stopped the furnaces, or would it have only caused more people to burn? Diplomatic analyses in the archives document that the Pope's strategy of saving lives with small steps was balanced by the fear of risking everything with loud shouts. Towards the end of the war, in folders from 1944 and 1945, clues begin to emerge regarding the infamous and controversial rat lines allegations, where the Vatican evolved from helping victims to turning a blind eye to the escape of war criminals. Reports that some clergymen provided Nazi officers with fake passports to escape to Latin America are still among the most researched and considered shameful pages of the archives. Today, Pius XII, a historian examining Pius's file, finds neither a saint nor a monster. Rather, they see the profile of a bureaucrat pope who, at history's darkest moment, attempted to play chess against immense evil with his limited diplomatic power, sometimes succeeding, but more often inflicting wounds through his silence. As we reach the end of Chapter 20, we will emerge from these dark and controversial chambers of the archives and turn towards legends, forbidden gospels, and the Vatican's future plans.
In one of the most secure sections of the Vatican archives are manuscripts from the early centuries of Christianity that tell stories very different from the Gospels we know: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. These are called apocryphal, meaning secret or alleged forgery. These texts are a kind of censored page of history, excluded from the official history written by the Vatican, as established by meetings such as the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century. Let's get straight to the point. Why were these texts banned or rejected? These ancient papyri in the archives contain surprising and sometimes frightening stories about Jesus' childhood. For example, in Thomas's childhood gospel, it is recounted that the child Jesus made birds out of clay and gave them life, or dried up a child who was angry with him with a single word. Vatican bureaucracy and theologians have excluded these texts from the canon, official list, believing that such uncontrolled miracle narratives damage the divine and dignified image of Jesus. One of the most mysterious pieces in the archive is the Gnostic Gospels. Copies of the texts found in Nag Hammadi in 1945 and other fragments in the archive offer a much more philosophical and individual interpretation of Christianity. These texts emphasize the message that the kingdom of God is within man, highlighting the lack of need for an institutional structure like the Church. For the Vatican, this was a threat to the institution's raison d'etre. Therefore, these texts were declared heretical and pushed outside the mainstream religion. Another major controversy is the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Some fragments in the archive claim that Mary was not merely a follower, but Jesus' closest disciple and the actual person with whom he shared his revelations. This situation represented an unacceptable alternative history for the church hierarchy, which had established a male-dominated structure for centuries. The administration, seeking to minimize the role of women in the church, preferred to lock such texts into the dark shelves of the archives. Why did the Vatican hide these texts instead of destroying them? Because these documents were necessary for identifying the enemy and providing a point of reference in theological debates. Archival officials viewed these texts as poisonous but necessary antiquities. Today, these apocryphal texts are an invaluable resource for historians of religion because they prove to us that Christianity was not a single block, but rather a multifaceted and colorful structure at its inception.
These secret texts show how the Vatican edited not only the world, but also the heavens and the sacred. Now, we move from these theological secrets to a much more modern and digital discussion.
The Vatican Archive and its affiliated Vatican Observatory, Specula Vaticana, are frequently associated with conspiracy theories such as alien autopsies or hidden UFO parts in popular culture. However, the real face of the archive indicates a deeper and theological preparation than Hollywood scenarios. The Vatican has been collecting scientific and philosophical reports for centuries in order not to be caught unprepared in case of the discovery of extraterrestrial life. Let's get straight to the point. Why is the Vatican interested in space? Astronomy records in the archive show that the Church has been one of the institutions that most meticulously followed the sky since the calendar reform, the Gregorian calendar, in the 16th century. Data from its advanced telescopes in Arizona and archival astrobiology reports prove that the Vatican views intelligent extraterrestrial life as a possibility, not a threat. In modern correspondence in the archive, if God created the universe, why wouldn't he have created life elsewhere? There are long theological analyses based on this question. So, is there a secret UFO file? In modern parts of the archive that are closed to the public, there are reports of unexplained celestial phenomena from Catholic missionaries and bishops around the world from the 1940s onwards. However, these reports do not involve diplomatic conversations with aliens, but rather internal discussions about how the Church should interpret such phenomena. The Vatican generally classifies such events as natural events or phenomena that have not yet been scientifically explained. One of the most interesting documents in the archive is the report prepared by Vatican Observatory Director José Gabriel Funes in 2008 and recorded in the archive. In this report, the concept of alieno mio fratello is discussed. Funes argues that the existence of extraterrestrial intelligent beings does not contradict the Catholic belief, and that these beings may even be innocent of sin. This is a preliminary protocol for how the Vatican will protect the cornerstones of religion in the event of a possible first contact. The space folder in the Vatican archives is actually a part of the desire to preserve sovereignty, not a fear. If one day extraterrestrial life is proven, the Vatican will put this thousands of pages of report on the table and say, "We were already ready for this, and this was part of God's plan." This silent preparation in the archive is also an indication of how the institution has survived for thousands of years. A file suitable for every scenario is waiting on the shelves. The Vatican archives contain not only manuscripts and diplomatic letters, but also centuries of observational data, star charts, and complex mathematical calculations. The Vatican Observatory, Specula Vaticana, is one of the oldest active astronomical research institutions in the world. The astronomical records in the archives prove that the Church was a force that not only intervened in science, but also produced scientific data itself. Let's get straight to the point. Why did the Church record the sky with such meticulousness? At the heart of this interest lies the Great Calendar Reform of 1582. The Julian calendar, used until then, had lost its alignment with the seasons, making it impossible to determine the date of Easter. 16th century records in the archives include the massive calculations made by a team led by the Jesuit astronomer Christopher Clavius for Pope Gregory XIII. The Gregorian calendar we use today is a result of the mathematical precision found on these dusty shelves.
Deep within the archives are records from the 18th and 19th century Carte du Ciel, or Map of the Sky project. The Vatican was one of the first institutions to participate in this international project, which aimed to create a vast photographic map of the universe. The glass negatives and hand-drawn star positions in the archives are invaluable data from the early days of modern astrophysics. These records are concrete evidence of the Church's philosophy that to understand God's work, one must read the universe. The location of the Vatican Observatory has also undergone strategic changes throughout its history. Archival records document that the observatory was first located in the Tower of Winds, Torre dei Venti, in the Vatican, then moved to Castel Gandolfo, the Pope's summer palace, to escape Rome's light pollution. And finally, today, in Arizona, it houses one of the world's most advanced telescopes, VIII. The technical correspondence in the archives show how Jesuit astronomers established an authority in the scientific world, not only through their religious identities, but also through their academic papers. The most interesting detail in this section is the meteorite collection records. Considered an extension of the Vatican archives, this inventory contains chemical analyses and testimonies of hundreds of meteorites that fell from around the world and were gifted to the Pope. These records prove that the Church's interest in extraterrestrial matter was not only theological, but entirely physical and scientific. The astronomical records illustrate how the Vatican attempted to blend rationality with faith. Sleepless nights spent by a priest at the telescope are preserved forever on the archive's shelves as sequences of coordinates and numbers. Now, from this celestial data, we will return to Earth and the hidden history of the Vatican's greatest earthly power, money and the banking system.
One of the most closely guarded sections of the Vatican archives, sealed with a strict secrecy seal, pertains to the centuries-long process of papal elections, or conclaves. The documents here contain raw records describing not only the selection of a religious leader, but also the power struggles, alliances, and how, once the doors of the Sistine Chapel were closed, contact with the outside world was completely severed. Let's look directly at the process. Although the ballots, or schede, used by each cardinal during the conclave were burned immediately after the election, the official records of the process and reports of the secret consultations held before the election are preserved deep within the archives. The records in the archive document how the two-thirds majority rule required for a papal candidate's election was applied, and how, throughout history, cardinals were starved to force them to make decisions during stalled elections. The word conclave itself comes from the Latin cum clave, meaning locked with a key. One of the most shocking documents in the archives is the record of the veto power. Until the beginning of the 20th century, the major Catholic powers of Europe, France, Spain, Austria, had the right to veto any candidate they deemed unsuitable. The official veto document used by the Austrian emperor to prevent the election of Cardinal Rampolla at the 1903 conclave is still in the archives. After this event, the newly elected Pope Pius X permanently banned this interference by foreign powers, and this ban is recorded as one of the strictest laws in the archives. But what happens after the election? Records in the archives confirm that the personal notes kept by each cardinal during the election are collected and destroyed at the end of the election, or, in very special cases, archived under the condition of eternal silence. However, the truly exciting piece is the official document recording the answer given by the elected person to the question, "Do you accept?" or "acceptasne," and the name they chose. This paper is the first physical evidence that the moment became official and changed the course of history. Furthermore, modern archives also contain stories of those who were not elected. Details such as why favored candidates were eliminated and which cardinal group formed blocs against which candidate prove that papal elections are not merely a spiritual process, but also the most sophisticated political chess game in the world. The complex mathematical calculations behind the white smoke rising from the Sistine Chapel are hidden in folders accessible only to a select few archival experts.
The conclave documents are the secret to the Vatican's continuity. They show how the system remains constant even as individuals change, and how a new folder is opened with each new pope. Now we will move from these elections behind closed doors to the great agreement that solidified the Vatican's place in the world as a state.
In the Vatican archives, there's a special category of documents written in a much heavier and darker language than others, bearing the inscription anathema, or curse. These are excommunication documents that declare kings, philosophers, or clergymen who rebelled against the Church's hierarchy as spiritually and socially dead. These records in the archives are proof of how the Vatican, even without an army, could shake empires with a single letter. Let's look directly at the horror of this penal system. A letter of excommunication is not just a simple piece of paper. Records from the 10th and 13th centuries in the archives detail how these ceremonies were performed. The pope or a bishop would throw a burning candle to the ground, extinguishing it, and say, "May his light be extinguished before God like this candle." The letter written after this moment declares that the person can no longer speak to or do business with any Christian and cannot be buried in the Holy Land upon death. One of the most famous punitive documents in the archives is the one that led to the March on Canossa in 1077. When Pope Gregory VII excommunicated Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, all of the emperor's subjects ceased to obey him. Correspondence in the archives shows that the fact that a great emperor, barefoot in the snow, begged for forgiveness at the Pope's door for 3 days was a result of the political earthquake created by this sealed document. This is one of the greatest triumphs of an ink stroke in history. Not only kings, but sometimes entire cities could be punished. The archives contain records of collective punishments called interdicts. If a city's ruler rebelled against the church, bells would not ring, baptisms would not be performed, and funeral prayers would not be held. Public complaints and desperate letters from local priests in the archives vividly document how such punishments paralyzed the social psychology. However, in the modern parts of the archives, we also see how this system of punishment evolved. In the 19th and 20th centuries, excommunication transformed from a political weapon into a doctrinal warning. For example, the 1949 decree that collectively excommunicated Catholics who were members of the Communist Party stands in the archives as a testament to the ideological warfare of the modern world. Letters of excommunication and condemnation constitute the dark library of the Vatican archives. These documents serve as a reminder of how the Church ruled the world not only with promises of reward and heaven, but also with absolute exclusion and fear. While these letters may now sit in museum showcases as historical artifacts, in their time they were burning embers capable of dethroning kings.
This section of the Vatican archives is a chronicle of the famous chess game played between the great dynasties of Europe, the Habsburgs, Bourbons, Romanovs, and Tudors, and the papacy. The letters here cover not only religious matters, but also declarations of war, peace treaties, power struggles, and even interdynastic marriage negotiations. Because the Pope was the supreme arbiter of Europe for centuries, every king or queen had to obtain a letter of authorization or support from him. Let's focus directly on the language and power of these correspondences. The letters in the archives convey the sender's power even through the quality of the ink and paper. Gold leaf embellishments, massive wax seals, and harsh threats disguised with diplomatic politeness are characteristic of these files. Napoleon's wrath. The archives contain letters written by Napoleon Bonaparte to Pope Pius VII, imposing his desire to completely seize control of Europe. Napoleon's letters are generally impatient and commanding in tone. The last letter of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland. Perhaps one of the most emotional pieces in the archive is Mary Stuart's letter to the Pope shortly before her execution. This letter is like a testament to a queen's death for her faith and her political isolation. Diplomatic ice with the Russian czars. The cold but respectful correspondence between Orthodox Russia and the Catholic Vatican documents how Europe was united, especially during the Napoleonic Wars. The greatest significance of these letters is that, unlike the official history written in history books, they reveal the real negotiations that took place behind closed doors. While a king claimed to be fighting in the name of God against his people, in a letter to the Pope, he could actually be describing his territorial claims and financial difficulties. By preserving these letters, the Vatican held all of Europe's secrets in its grasp and used this information as leverage when needed. These archives also contain very intimate details, from genetic diseases of dynasties to requests for recognition of illegitimate children. The Vatican was not just a church, but also the largest archival bank of European aristocracy. Royal letters prove to us that Europe was governed like a family feud, and that the ultimate father, the Pope, always tried to have the last word. Now we move from these aristocratic correspondences to that great political turning point that formalized the Vatican's place and independence in the modern world.
The Vatican archives have fueled so many legends with their mystery that they have become, in people's minds, a veritable esoteric wonderland. However, modern archivists and historians who have managed to gain access are proving with documents that some popular claims are merely figments of the imagination. Not a single parchment fragment exists in the archives to support the claim, a favorite theme of fiction writers like Dan Brown, that Jesus was actually married and has descendants. The claim that the Vatican keeps such a family tree or a secret gospel about Jesus' wife in vaults does not align with historical and archaeological data. The archives contain unofficial texts, apocryphals, about Jesus' life, but these are not a conspiracy, but rather rejected theological interpretations. One of the most widespread legends is that books salvaged from the burning Library of Alexandria were secretly transported to the Vatican. The archive's inventories do not support this claim. Yes, the Vatican possesses numerous ancient manuscripts, but these generally came through diplomatic gifts or purchases during the Renaissance. The idea that all the lost knowledge of the ancient world is imprisoned here doesn't seem physically feasible. The idea that the Vatican holds crashed UFO fragments or the text of a treaty with aliens is entirely fictional. As we discussed in Chapter 22, the Vatican is interested in space, but this interest is scientific and philosophical, not a technological storage operation. Some conspiracy theorists claim the Vatican possesses a device called the chronovisor that allows it to see the past and future. There is neither a plan nor a user manual nor a photograph of this device in the archives. The archives consist of ink and paper, not metal and wires. People often imagine a secret folder at the center of the archives containing a single secret that will shake the entire world. The truth is, the power of the archives lies not in a single document, but in 85 kilometers of detail. The real secrets are hidden in diplomatic correspondence, small notes, and centuries of silent politics. To view the Vatican archives as a fantasy movie set obscures the real historical labor and the true significance of the documents there. It contains not magic books, but real, sometimes very boring, but vital accounts of humanity, politics, and religion.
Now, with a mind free from these myths, we will turn to the most important political document of the archives, how the Vatican gained its current borders and sovereignty as a state. The archives teach us how fragile history is.
If the Vatican had not preserved these documents, even though they sometimes contain its darkest secrets, we would only be hearing about Galileo's repentance, Bruno's steadfastness, or the conspiracies against the Knights Templar from legends today. For the Vatican, history is a chronicle of God's plan on earth. Therefore, they have chosen to preserve documents, even those containing their own mistakes, rather than destroy them. For them, time is a maturing process, where the truth will inevitably come to light one day, but these truths will be too outdated to destroy the institution. The renaming of this place, known for centuries as the Secret Archives, Archivium Secretum, to the Apostolic Archives by Pope Francis in 2019, is a symbolic revolution. The Church has now understood that knowledge cannot be imprisoned, and that in the digital age, absolute secrecy breeds nothing but suspicion. However, this transparency is not the transparency of a glass house. It is a controlled, time-bound opening that prioritizes the institution's survival. Although the archive's doors are more open to researchers than ever before, those inaccessible sections remain shrouded in mystery. On every page of the archive, we see the dance between spiritual authority and earthly power. On one side, a power that brought kings to their knees with letters of excommunication. On the other, a structure striving to protect its dogmas in the face of scientific truths. The archives prove to us that the Vatican is a state governed not only by prayers, but also by ink, diplomacy, and knowledge. Faith forms the spirit of these documents, while politics is the concrete reason why they were written.